Hi, and welcome to this lesson from LaunchCode in our Intro to Spring Boot series. In this lesson, we're going to introduce the third and final component of MVC, the models, and we're going to talk about some related topics. And this will be the first of a few lessons that we'll talk about using model classes effectively within all portions of our Spring Boot applications. Let's briefly revisit this diagram that we've become familiar with, the MVC flow diagram. And so far, just to recap, we've looked at the controller portion of our Spring Boot applications, how to create controllers to handle requests that are coming in from the user. The controller, again, is sort of the traffic cop, the main point of entry for our system. We've also looked at creating views and templates using the TimeLeaf template engine, and in doing so, we were able to separate the presentation of our application and the presentation of the data from the controller itself, and we saw some ways to reuse components of templates and views. Today we're going to look at the portion at the top left, and we're not actually going to incorporate a database into our applications yet. That's going to be sort of an equally large and sophisticated topic that we'll cover in a week or two. But right now we are going to integrate the blue model portion of this diagram into our application. We'll be using model classes, and we'll be separating the data from our controller and have a proper separation of MVC responsibilities. So a few topics that we'll touch on in the next lesson or two. The first is creating what we call POJOs, or plain old Java objects. These will be our model classes, and by a POJO we just mean that there's nothing that special about the class that we will be creating to serve as a model within our application. It won't be extending another special class. It won't be part of the framework. It'll be literally a class that you could use in a console application if you wanted to. And so, by plain old Java object, we just mean that that's not inherently tied to or part of the framework or the rest of the application that we're working with. We're going to look at how we can ensure that our objects are distinct. When we create model objects, we'll see some issues that can arise if we don't have a good mechanism for telling objects apart from one another. So we'll look at how to do that. We'll also look at moving all of the data operations out of the controller layer, and we'll show you specifically where that'll happen. If you recall from the last time we looked at the Cheese MVC application, we were storing lists or hash maps of strings within the controller as a static collection, and so that's not a good practice in general because it doesn't allow the data to be separate from the controller. And then finally, we'll look at using model binding to auto-create model classes when a user submits form data. And so that's going to be a handy thing for us to do. It'll save us a little bit of code, and as we'll see in future lessons, it'll also help us validate user input. Okay, so let's go ahead and jump over to IntelliJ. And as with previous lessons, I encourage you to follow along with this. I will post the code that we're starting with and the code that we end with on the video notes page. But I do encourage you to follow along and kind of code through these steps as we go together. So I'm starting off with essentially the same application that we ended our last lessons with when we were looking at the Cheese MVC application. So in the last lessons, we started with views, and we incorporated view templates into our application. And so that's really what I'm starting with. There are a couple of changes I did make, though, that I want to show you. And I'll add some resources to these for the video notes page. The one main thing that I did is in my fragments, I added a Bootstrap style sheet and a Bootstrap JavaScript file. So Bootstrap is a really nice CSS, HTML, JavaScript framework, and all that means is that it's very simple to integrate this into your application and make your application just look a lot nicer by doing minimal work. So getbootstrap.com is the main site for it. You can come here, and the CSS and components pages have lots of useful information about just really basic examples about how to clean up your web pages and to use Bootstrap effectively within your applications. So I encourage you, we're not going to spend a lot of time focusing on this as lesson content, but we'll see, and we'll kind of talk about as we go, just simple ways that you can use Bootstrap to just make your application look a little bit nicer. So the way that I've added Bootstrap is to use a Bootstrap CDN. So a CDN is a centralized place where you can pull in hosted files into your application. So here at bootstrapcdn.com. Again, I'll put this link in the video notes. You can copy this, the CSS and the JavaScript file necessary to run Bootstrap, and then you can just drop those right into your head fragment in your fragments.html, and this will make those files available to every place that uses this head fragment. In this case, we're using it in every one of our other templates, so will essentially make this available to every template within our application. And so let me go ahead and start up the application, and I'll show you just what this did to clean up the look and feel of our app. So you've already been using this, and the assignment 2 incorporated Bootstrap as well, and we'll use it as we go forward. Again, it's not something you're going to be required to use or have to use, but it is a really great, easy way to clean up the look and feel of your applications. Okay, so yeah, so what Bootstrap is doing currently is it's giving me this nice font and heading. It's styling some of these things. I've got some nice little basic padding around the edge here. Let's go ahead and add an item to this list. We get some form styling. That's been provided by Bootstrap. I'll show you how that was done. All right, and I get some nice table styling as well. So this is just a basic table, but by adding a simple Bootstrap class, I can make it look much, much nicer than the default browser styles. Let's go back and look at some of the changes we made within our templates just to enable some of these basic styles using Bootstrap. So I'm going to come back over here, and we obviously added, we talked about this a moment ago, we added the style sheet and JavaScript file from the CDN that we showed you before. Let me open up the index page here. The other thing I did was every body class has, or every body element rather, has this class equals container. And this will allow some styles to be applied to the body of our pages. And then within the pages themselves, there are a few things that get some basic classes too. So if I add class equals table to a table element, that will give us this nice clean table display as well. Let's see, where else did we make changes? I'm going to go into the add. So if we look at just to remind ourselves of what this looked like, this form, this add form, what I did there was I used these form group wrapper divs to wrap a label and input that go together. And then within that, I used a form control on the text inputs. So the form control will make these text inputs nice and wide, and the form group will give it this styling where these are kind of styled in a way that makes it clear that they go together and the label is next to the input. So I have a div wrapping a label and input that go together with class equals form group. On the input text box, I have form control. And if I just put the form control here, that would have made these inputs, the width of the entire page, 100% width. I didn't really want that, so I went ahead and on the form itself, I just put a max width. So this will constrain it just a little bit so that it only goes this wide as opposed to stretching all across the screen. So nothing that's rocket science here. It might have been a while since you've used CSS in Unit 2. That's okay. Again, use this as much as you like or as little as you like, but it is something that you can easily do. And it's really easy to go to the Bootstrap page and to look at things and get a feel for how to easily add bits and pieces to your applications to make them look nicer, especially when it comes to things like tables and forms that traditionally just look really bad if you're only using the default HTML stuff. Okay, so there's just a few changes. Again, I'll put some links in the video notes, and we will provide the starter code for this video lesson as well. Okay, so let's go ahead and we have our application started up. So I just want to show you a problem with the way this works to motivate the work we're about to do. So I added one cheese item here called cheddar. Let me go ahead and add another one. Let me add another cheddar cheese. And this one's going to be a mild yellow. And notice what happened here. Instead of getting two different cheddars, I only have one. Okay, and this is because if we go back to our code and we look at our controller, we see that at the top, the cheeses are stored in a hash map. So they're stored as string pairs. So the key is the name of the cheese, the value of each hash map entry is the description, okay? And so we did this before when we didn't have the utility of classes. All we had was collections and some other basic things. And so that was a reasonable way to do it, but we see that it presents a problem in terms of how we would like our application to work. Ideally, we should be able to have multiple items in this list with the same name. There's no reason why, from a user standpoint, that should be prohibited. Maybe some applications might want to restrict names, but that should be a validation level concern rather than a constraint that like our application has simply because we are only using a certain type of collection, right? So that's generally not a good thing that our data structure works this way. So how we're going to get around that is to use proper objects to represent the data within our application. Okay, so instead of storing things in a hash map here, we're going to introduce a Java class to store our data. Okay, so let's go ahead and do that. I'm going to stop my application. And the first thing I'm going to do to integrate a class is to create a new models package. So go to org.launchcode and right click, and we're going to make a package called models. So I selected new package. Models is all lowercase. And within that models package, I want to make a new Java class. And I'm going to call this cheese. Okay, and I do want to add this to version control, so we'll select yes there. Okay, so this class is going to represent the data that I'm working with in my application, and in particular, it's going to replace this string representation of my data. So what are the data items that I want to be able to store? Well, I have a couple of things. I have a name and a description to start with, so let's go ahead and make fields for those. Make a private string name and a private string description. Okay, so these are just going to store those two items within my cheese class. And then there's a lot of other stuff I want to create. I want to create getters and setters for these. I want to create a constructor. Let me show you a tip. If you haven't found this functionality within IntelliJ already, you can have IntelliJ auto create a bunch of that boilerplate code for you. So I'm going to right click in here and go to the generate menu item. And this will give me some options on different types of code that IntelliJ can auto generate for me. So let's go ahead and first generate a constructor. Okay, and here I can select the fields that I want my constructor to initialize. In this case, I want my constructor to take both name and description and to initialize those. So I'm going to say okay there. All right, so now I have a constructor. One note is the code that's auto-generated by Eclipse here, or sorry, IntelliJ rather, uses this .name to refer to the field within the object. We've been more often using a convention, at least in the online textbook, of using a different input parameter naming convention here so that we didn't have to use this on name. So if we precede this by a name, which is a convention that we've adopted and some Java developers will use, we don't have to precede the field with this. Okay, so if we, however, have the same name for both the field and the method's input parameters, essentially this would be what's called shadowing the field name. So in order to specifically refer to the field, we have to say this.name to tell Java that we mean the field of the class and not the method input. Okay, so you've probably seen this. Your instructor or classmates have probably used this before, but since we haven't been using it a lot in the textbook, I just wanted to introduce that. Okay, now let me generate getters and setters. So using the same approach, I'm going to right click and say generate, and I'm going to select getter and setter. And here I can select which fields I want getters and setters for. And this will again just create the minimal basic getters and setters. So we've talked about different ways that you might want to customize getters and setters in terms of the access level, making some private or protected, doing certain types of actions when someone sets a field or gets a field. You can go ahead and add that code in if you needed to. In this case, all we want is the basic getters and setters, and so this is just fine. Now we have a cheese class that has a name and description. We can create a new cheese class, and we can get and set the properties of that class. Okay, so that's all we're going to need to start with. We'll come back to to this class and add some items later on. But let's go ahead and continue with our coding. So now I want to refactor my cheese controller to use the cheese class rather than storing the data as strings. And so refactor, that's a word I'll start using more and more. Refactor means to change your code in a way that doesn't affect the user-facing behaviors, but improves your code, makes it more modular or cleaner, reduces duplication, things like that. That's what refactor means. So when we say refactor, we mean improving our code while not necessarily adding new features, okay? So here I'm going to, rather than store my data as a hash map of string pairs, let's go ahead and make this an array list that stores cheese objects. Okay. And I will need to import this, so I can come up here and say import org.launchcode.models.cheese. Okay. And we have some errors that popped up because we changed the data type of that collection, but we'll fix those in 1 second. Okay, so that looks good. So now our cheeses will be stored in this array list as cheese objects. And this is going to be nice because we can have 2 different cheese objects with the same name field, the same value in their name field, and not have that conflict anymore. Okay, and we'll see explicitly that that works once we make these other updates. Let's go ahead and go down here and fix our code where the errors are. So in this process add cheese form, this is the method that is processing a post request to add a new cheese. And in particular, we're getting an error here because previously we were putting that data in as a key value pair within the hash map. We no longer have a hash map, we have an array list. And even further, we no longer are storing it as just plain strings, but we need to wrap this data in an object. So let's go ahead and fix that. I'm going to say that I want to make a cheese, new cheese. And then I'm going to call the cheese constructor that we created a moment ago. Okay, and then I want to wipe out this and say cheeses.add new cheese. So this will add that new cheese object to my array list. Okay, and that's the only change we need to make there. Down here in the removed cheese form, I had a form that's displaying cheeses to remove them from the list. And previously I was just sending over the keys, just the names of the cheeses. Let's go ahead and wipe that out and send over the entire array list. Okay, and it looks like that that gets rid of all of the errors at least. I don't, in particular, it's not going to fix all the problems. This method down here will still have some issues. We'll discuss what those are in a second. But we're not out of the woods yet. We need to update our templates. Our templates were also relying on the fact that we had our data stored in hash maps. So let's go ahead and update our templates to properly display our data. Okay, I'm going to start with the index template. And in the index template, when I'm generating these table rows, I iterate over the cheeses collection, and I was previously getting the data out as key value pairs. Now, we don't specify types of data in here, so I'm not going to change, I don't have to do anything to say that now this is a cheese object as opposed to a key value pair. I do, however, need to update the way that I'm accessing data within that iterator. So instead of saying key and value, I can explicitly say name and description. And that turns out to be all I need to do. Now this is interesting because I'm using cheese.name, and you might say, well, the name field is a private field, right? So how can you access that in the template? We're not supposed to be able to touch private stuff. What's really happening behind the scenes is TimeLeaf will call the getter for the name field when we use this syntax. So that's just a facet of the way TimeLeaf works. And that's all we'll need to do to display the name and descriptions for our cheeses. Let's go to the add form and see if there's anything there we need to update. This actually isn't receiving any data from the controller. It's only taking data and passing it back to the controller. So there's nothing here we need to update right now, at least. In this remove form, we have a similar problem to what we saw on the index. So here, this previously was iterating over the names of the cheeses. Now this is going to be iterating over the entire list of cheese objects. So my labels and my inputs need to be modified to display the cheese name, as opposed to what was previously, this did represent the cheese name. Now it represents, an entire cheese object. So let's go ahead and add .name to each of these. And again, if your code, you probably did some additional work on it. If it's not exactly the same as this, that's expected. I actually would be surprised if you were starting with code that was exactly the same as this. You can refer to the starter code on the video page and pause and kind of rework your code to kind of keep up in the right way. Okay, so this should now display a value on the checkbox for the cheese name. The ID is now the cheese name. The labels text will be the cheese name, etc. So that should all work. And those are all the updates we need to make, okay? Our application's still, even though we've got a lot of files, still relatively small compared to most applications, so there's not a ton of changes to make there. Let's go ahead and start it up and test and see how we did. All right, that started up just fine. Again, notice that when we restart our application, we lose all of our data because we're not using a database, so don't be surprised by that. Let me just add some data now. All right, so I was able to add one item. Let me try to add another item with the same name. Right, we said that should be an issue that's fixed by refactoring to use a model class rather than string data. And indeed it is. So that looks all great. Let me add one more that's not cheddar. Okay, so I've got 3 items. Let's test our remove functionality. I go here to remove, and I've got 2 cheddars and a Velveeta. Let's try to remove the Velveeta. And we see that did not work, okay? And that's actually what I expected. I don't think that you should have expected that, but let's look at why that didn't work. Okay, so if we go to the cheese controller and we look at the method that is removing cheeses from the list, this process remove cheese form, this takes an array of strings which correspond to the names of the cheeses. And that, we saw that when we looked at the remove template, that exactly is what we're still sending over. We're still sending over the names of cheeses. However, when I get into this method, I'm going to loop over the array of names and I'm going to call cheeses.remove. So previously this was a hash map, and by saying that we wanted to remove a certain item, that was treating that as the key or the entry in the hash map with this key. Now we no longer have a hash map, so saying .remove with just a string, just a name, doesn't really make sense anymore. Okay, so that essentially this method call just doesn't do anything. So that's why we saw that when we tried to remove cheeses, we actually didn't. So actually updating this to work the way we want to is going to be slightly more complicated than we can deal with right now. So I'm going to leave this problem in here for a moment, and then we'll come back once we do some additional work to update our application. Okay, and that's actually going to conclude the first part of this lesson. I'm breaking this lesson up into 2 chunks. So that concludes the first part. And just to rehash what we did, we refactored our code to use a cheese model class rather than storing our data as string data in a hash map. Okay, so we'll come back in the second part of our lesson and we'll look at how to solve this issue of how to remove cheeses, and we'll also look at how to solve the issue of getting the data out of our controllers as well.